Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 31st episode of the Manor Podcast. I'm your co-host, Roger Bodee, joined as always with my best friend and other co-host, Michael Hamilton. Michael, are you on Santa's naughty or nice list this year?
I feel like I haven't done a lot of bad things, so hopefully the nice list.
Oh, what do you think he's bringing you this year then?
Maybe it's time we had a talk. So Santa isn't real.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. So
I'm painfully aware of how unreal Santa is, but...
So he's not bringing me anything.
That's fair. It's more of a Christmas question, kind of a theme joke for the holiday spirit, but I guess if you're just going to be Scrooge McDuck over there, I won't ask you any more Christmas questions, Michael.
That's me, Scrooge McDuck.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
What is Santa bringing you for Christmas, or how would you have answered that question?
I think I'm getting a PlayStation 5 from Santa Claus / my wife.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, but we'll see. And if I don't get a PlayStation 5, I'll just send her home gym equipment back in the mail, and then we'll call it even.
Okay. Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you want to talk about Flesh and Blood?
What do you want to talk about, Flesh and Blood? There's a lot that we could discuss in that topic.
So I've been doing these coaching sessions for a while now.
Oh, yeah? How could you sign up for those coaching sessions?
Through the MNR Cast Patreon. You can join
what's the URL for that? Is it www.patreon.com/MNRcast?
I hope so, because you just said that.
Yeah.
But I've noticed that there's common things that most people could work on to get better. And I think I'm not even exempt of these are the things that I focus on. And a lot of the time when I guess my coaching students come talk to me, these are kind of the things that I frequently point out as things they could work at. And I wanted to just kind of go through them. And I think that would help our audience a lot about figuring out what to work on, I guess.
Okay. So I guess first things first, if you want to get better or work on in the game, do you know how the game works? So you get to pick a hero, and in Classic Constructed, you start at 40 life total points. And when you lose all of your 40 life total points, you lose the game. Do most people kind of know how that works?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. That's a good start.
So I think the things that I want to talk about aren't things that beginners won't be able to understand, or at least understand what I'm saying, though they might not appreciate everything. But I think most people will be able to learn something from this, even people that have played Flesh and Blood for a while. So
hit me with your first example then.
So the first thing that I think everyone should work on is make sure you're maximizing your value from hand to hand. And this is something we talk about. We don't talk about it a lot, but kind of instinctually do with every hand. Is you're I have 2-3 blocks and maybe a scar for a scar and a snatch. So, and your 3 blocks are worth less than 3 points if you use them on offense. Maybe it's blue Autumn's Touch and blue Force of Nature or something. And with that hand, you want to block with the 2-3 blocks and then play the scar for a scar with Go Again and then play the snatch. And that's kind of basic, I guess. But there's an alternative line of you could cast the Force of Nature fusing the Autumn's Touch to buff your scar for a scar. And then you could play the scar for 5. And now if it hits, it threatens to draw a card. And then you play the snatch that also threatens to draw a card. And if you just add up the value from that, you're getting 9 points of value from that play using 3 cards. And you can arsenal the blue Autumn's Touch, but that's not a great arsenal. Versus if you just block with the 2-3 blocks, you're getting 3 points on each 3 blocks. So that's 6 points, and you're getting 8 points of damage on your attacks for another 8 damage. So you get 14 points of value and no arsenal. And you just kind of want to look at the raw math, and that's usually how you should play your hand, I guess. And I think the first thing that sticks out is just make sure you're getting the most value out of every hand.
Okay. So I guess my questions on that would be, doesn't that mean that people should almost never block in Flesh and Blood? Because almost always you're getting more value out of using your cards offensively than defensively.
So that is pretty accurate for some decks. They should basically very rarely be blocking, because most of the cards in a Phi deck are better attacking than blocking. And the main times you block is when you have 2 blues and you just block with one of your blue 3 blocks, because you can't really use the second blue efficiently. And outside of that, you probably shouldn't be blocking that often, unless I guess that the reason you would block, other than to maximize your hand's efficiency, is to stop on hits, or because these on hits are basically worth some amount of value. And that's another thing that we'll get to. But
You okay? Have
yeah,
I thrown you for a loop with my first question?
no,
You haven't.
no, but you like so every on hit, I guess I'm gonna jump around. I probably should have had these in a different order. So when they are attacking you with a card that has an on hit, you should try to assign a value to that on hit. And this is another thing that was on my list, but that's fine. We're jumping around because this is a good question. So if your opponent plays a snatch, attacks for 4, if it hits, they draw a card. If they have one card in hand and they have no way to give the snatch go again, then the on hit is worth nothing because they're going to draw a card. They'll have 2 cards, they'll arsenal 1, and then only draw 3 cards at the end of the turn. So the snatch on hit isn't netting anything. So it's basically because they're going to end up with the same amount of cards if the snatch was blocked out because they'd still arsenal and then draw 4 cards versus drawing a card off snatch and then drawing 3 cards at the end of the turn. Same number of total cards. And every time your opponent plays an on hit, you should try to assign a numeric value to it. So snatch with 1 card in hand with no go again is worth, the on hit's worth 0. Snatch with no cards in hand, you can kind of try to figure out the average value of a card in their deck. Shortcut, it's roughly 3 because blues aren't as good of arsenals as reds, and most decks have some number of blues in them. So like even if they have a bunch of red 0 for 4s, sometimes they're just going to draw a blue off the snatch. So it's pretty safe to roughly average out the value of a draw card to 3. And then there's other things that other on hits that you can try to evaluate as well. Like if they play Command and Conquer, depending on how much your card in arsenal is worth, that's how much the value of the Command and Conquer is. If they play Erase Face, then you look at your hand and you're like, how much does this disrupt me? What is this costing me if it hits? And then you try to assign a numeric value to that. And that's how much that on hit is worth.
Okay. What about like effects like crush effects? Because that's not just an on hit that has a damage threshold that it needs to crush.
Yeah. So a crush effect is essentially the same as an on hit. The only difference is to prevent the on hit, you need to prevent all the damage except 3 or less. So
math checks out.
If you look at like Spinal Crush, basically you need to block for 6 to prevent the on hit from happening. If the on hit would mess with your hand, which it does a lot of the time, but you need to block for 6 to prevent the on hit from happening. So the biggest difference between crush and regular on hits is if you overblock, let's say you block the Spinal Crush for 7, maybe you have a 3 block and 2 block equipment that you want to use on it, then you're not throwing away damage. Whereas if you block a snatch with a 3 block and a 2 block equipment, you're throwing away an extra point of value. So that's really the only difference basically between crush effects and on hit effects is that you can kind of overblock the on hit effect. Otherwise, you can evaluate them the same way. Whereas if they play a Spinal Crush, you look at your hand, you look at what your damage output is. If the Spinal Crush effect doesn't happen, if you just, let's say if you took 9 damage and it didn't have a crush effect, what would be your hand's maximum? Then actually that doesn't matter because you're either going to block or your stuff will have go again. So you look at what happens if how you can most efficiently use your hand if the crush effect does happen and you don't get go again. So maybe you have 2 blues and a Thunderquake and you can arsenal your last card. You don't really care about the crush effect. Or maybe you're Fi or Briar, and if you get this crush effect, you basically get to play 1 card and not really do anything with the other cards. In those situations, then you should look at what the highest value you can get out of your hand is. So if you have a 4-card hand with no arsenal and you have 1 3 block, I'm trying to think of exact specific hands to give an example, and I didn't prepare specific hands for this. So
you don't have to give me specific examples.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay.
I've noticed though, we focused exclusively on a third, or not even a third, just like I think a fifth of the total card types in Flesh and Blood, though, because we're talking exclusively about attack actions so far, and we still have non-attack, attack reactions, defense reactions, and instants to cover. So how do you evaluate the rate on those cards in your hand, though?
So attack reactions and defense reactions are both pretty face up what they're worth. They're usually just worth however much damage they say minus their cost. So for example, a Razor Reflex is worth 3 points of damage, costs 1 resource. So you just kind of figure out how that resource works into the curve of your hand. If you're going to have a resource for the Razor Reflex, then it's worth 3 damage. And sometimes the Go Again enables additional damage, which is nice. But like the main thing you're looking at is if you play your entire hand or different like subsets of cards rather than trying to evaluate each card individually. So like maybe you have a blue and a 1 cost attack and a Razor Reflex. And you could kind of look at what happens if you pitch the blue to play the 1 cost attack and the Razor Reflex versus if you instead just block with your whole hand, which is worth more value there. And that probably depends a lot on what your weapon is. If your weapon's like a Dawn Blade or something that you can spend your last resource efficiently to get more damage in, your hand's probably going to be more efficient attacking. But if not, it might just be more efficient to just block with your hand instead.
Okay. But wouldn't Razor Reflex also be like 1 for 4 though? Because like if you get the action point though, so it has the range of being a 1 for 3 and a 1 for 4 because it could give you that action point, which would add the last point of value, right?
So
Assuming that you can use the action point, yes, but yeah.
Yeah, it's really weird to try to assign value to like individual cards like that because an action point's only worth whatever you do with the action point, right? An action point intrinsically should give you a point of value because cards that cost an action point are generally stated to have one more power than cards that don't.
Mm-hmm.
So it should be worth about 1 point of damage, but that's not always the case. It's really contextual.
Well, I'm not saying like point of damage. I'm saying like just point of value, right? So like you always say an action point's usually worth around like 1 value, right? Like in the example you just gave, where like normally, like I guess if the attack doesn't have go again, it would have an extra point of damage, but it could also have some other benefit aside from that as well, like some kind of on hit effect or something like that. So like these kind of like abilities outside of just like raw numbers on the card in attack or defense value are usually worth, I guess, like a resource or like a value of 1, right? So like let's change Razor Reflex's ability so that on hit you gain a resource. So gaining a resource versus gaining an action point, those would still be 4 total value you're getting on hit, right?
Yeah, basically, but you have to make sure you're able to convert the resource or the action point into something because
right, because accruing that value and not utilizing anything with it is meaningless. I get it.
Yeah. You're just like wasting the value. So like instead of trying to assign a value to the Razor Reflex specifically, you should see like what your hand is worth if you play the Razor Reflex versus what your hand is worth if you block with the Razor Reflex. So let's say your hand is Snatch, Razor Reflex, and a blue 3 block. Your choices are you can play the Snatch, pitch the blue to play the Razor Reflex, and I don't know what your weapon is. What your weapon is matters a lot in this situation. But let's say instead of Snatch, let's simple it down. Let's go to Wounding Blow, 0 for 4, no text. So basically your options are you can block with the blue 3 block and Snatch. You can block for 5 points with that and play the Wounding Blow for 4 points for a total of 9 points of value. Or your other option is you can attack with the Wounding Blow and then pitch the blue and play a Razor Reflex, which would give you 7 points of value. So in that case, it's generally better to block with the blue and the Razor Reflex unless you can use those 2 remaining resources and action point to get more than 2 points of damage there.
What if your opponent has a defense reaction, then you don't get to go again, though?
So that's kind of the problem with conditional go against, like Razor Reflex and also Arachne's boots can lead to similar situations where ideally, if it works as intended, you'll get this much value, and if it doesn't, then you'll get less. And that's kind of part of why cards like Razor Reflex have fallen out of favor, is because when you take damage to keep a hand, including Razor Reflex, you're like pretty reliant on getting the go again from Razor Reflex. If you keep a hand because it gets more damage by playing it, but the way you get your action point is through the Razor Reflex, then if your opponent is able to block out the Razor Reflex, you miss out on a lot of value because you end up just like wasting 2 cards or wasting a full card or something. And then on the other hand, if you don't need the go again from the Razor Reflex, then you're going to waste that action point that the Razor Reflex generated for you. So it's kind of tricky to evaluate hands with Razor Reflex because of this. And I think that the card isn't great for those reasons unless you are a deck that is both able to use the action point well and...
Sure, but I think this kind of proves like the underlying thing of what I'm getting at with all of my pseudo trolling pushing back questions, though, is that we started at the premise that you should start with with each hand. Your note says first prioritize should be to maximize the raw value of it. But as we're getting it further and further into the weeds here on like what actual values are, even myself struggles with this. What is even the value of a card when I play it? So it's hard to like maximize the value of something when you don't even know what it is to begin with, I guess.
Sure. So I guess if you look at this hand of Wounding Blow plus Razor Reflex, and let's say your weapon's just some weapon that you could spend one resource to attack.
Harmonized Kodachi.
Okay, let's say it's Harmonized Kodachi then. Well, then I would suggest pitching the blue and attacking with the 2 Kodachis and then playing the wounding. But if your weapon is Harmonized Kodachi, then, and you don't have a 0 cost, I guess. So then you could, I guess if you look at it like that, then you have your 3-card hand that does 7 damage. If the Razor Reflex hits and gets go again, you can convert one of those 2 resources into 1 more damage. So that's 8 total damage, which is still worse than blocking for 5 and attacking for 4, because that would be 9 total damage. And at that point, like, you should just block with the cards.
Awesome. We did it. We got through it. We got through the first sign of assigning value to a hand. I'm proud of us, Michael.
So I'm going to jump to, in my notes, I put this at the bottom, but I'm going to jump to it now.
Wait, which direction are you jumping? Back? Forward? Sideways?
Jumping down to the next point, which is try to assign value to things that even things that don't have a clear value. So we kind of talked about this a little bit during on hits, but there are a lot of other cards, like you were saying, that have value that's not really clear. Like if you put a channel like Frigid or a channel Mount Heroic into play, what is the value of that? And these things aren't things that you can easily assign value to, but you need to try to assign value to them. Otherwise, it'll be impossible to basically make good decisions about how you're going to play the game. So one easy one is channel Mount Heroic. I think it's one of the easier ones to assign value to. So early in the game, if you can play your channel Mount Heroic and attack with a 0 for 4 on the same turn, then immediately it's worth 3 points of damage, and then it's worth 3 more points of damage on the following turn for each attack action you play. Yeah. And there are weird shenanigans sometimes where you pitch 2 Earth cards on your second turn and it stays around for an extra turn, but I think that's like far enough outside the norm that it's reasonable to not really, I think it's reasonable to kind of like ignore those cases where that happens, because it doesn't happen very often unless your deck's specifically built around that. But for the most part, it's not happening that often. So like if you look at a game state where it's early in the game and you have a blue Earth card, channel Mount Heroic, and a 0 for 4, then you kind of weigh the value of this channel Mount Heroic that you're putting into play plus this blue Earth card. So the turn you play it, it's going to be worth 3 if you just have a single 0 for 4 that turn, and then it's worth 3 more damage for each turn card. It's worth 3 more damage for each attack you play the following turn. And that can be really hard to know how many attacks you're going to play the following turn. It's usually around 2, sometimes 3, sometimes a million if you play Force of Nature Fused and draw a bunch of cards.
Yeah, we're going to get there. Don't worry about it.
You kind of like all these different numbers don't actually, like all these different possibilities only matter, like only the average really matters. So I don't know what the average number of cards or attacks you're going to play the turn after you play a channel Mount Heroic if you have no arsenal and no embodiment of lightning. So I don't know exactly what the value of channel Mount Heroic is. I think, or I would guess that the average is around 2 attacks the following turn. And that's kind of just from experience playing with and against Briar. I'm not a Briar expert. If someone runs the math and tells me the exact number is 2.4 something, I'd be like, okay. If you can assign a value to the channel Mount Heroic based on the fact that you're playing 1 card the turn you play it, 1 attack the turn you play it, then 2 attacks the following turn, that's 9 points of value. That means that the blue you're pitching for it plus the channel Mount Heroic are worth 9 on offense. If you take that as you're getting 1 attack the turn you play and then 2 attacks the turn after. Which again, I don't know if that is correct. And it obviously changes based on the context of the game. If you're at 3 life, you're probably not getting to play 2 attacks the following turn. You're probably going to be in a spot where you have to block.
So what happens if the channel Mount Heroic, when you're playing Briar, nets you an action point? Does that push it up to 4 points of value the first time you play it? So you lead with like a Nimbleism, and then you play channel Mount Heroic, and you get your embodiment of lightning, but you don't have the attack. So that's just 1 point of value that turn that you're getting off of it.
So if you play if you play Nimbleism into channel with no attack, then your Nimbleism is a -3, or it's worth 0 basically. It's not a negative, but it's worth 0. And then the channel, well, I guess like you evaluate it together. So like the Nimbleism plus the channel plus the blue card is worth whatever that action point plus the channel is worth the following turn. And maybe having an embodiment means that you're going to get 2.6 attacks on average instead of 2 attacks on average the following turn because you have that extra action point. Then that would mean that the channel is worth 3 times that 2.6, which would be 7.2 points of value, which is fine. Not great for a blue and a channel.
Yeah, but what happens if you get to lead with a snatch on the following turn because of that, and you get snatched on the go again, but that pushes the on hit on the snatch because of that?
So you're not going to know that when you play your channel. Like ideally, a supercomputer would evaluate all these different possible hands you draw for the next turn and be able to just come up with a numerically correct value for everything in every situation. And it would change based on the context of every card you've seen. Maybe there's still 3 snatches in your deck, then suddenly this embodiment of lightning is worth slightly more on when your deck has these contents versus if you've played 2 of your snatches, then this embodiment of lightning might be worth less. But again, we're not supercomputers. We just try to figure out as close approximations as we can to what the value of everything based on math. So I do want to talk about some other kind of tricky cards. Another one that is commonly sees a lot of play, I guess, is Channel Lake Frigid. And in decks that are not Icelander, I think this card it can struggle to get its value when you play it. So it costs almost 2 full cards to play it. It costs a card and 2 resources, so 2/3 of another card. And if you can't spend that last resource, it basically costs 2 full cards. And when you play Channel Lake Frigid, you basically need to make up for that 2 full cards or however much it costs you to play it. So if your opponent has a blue and 3 0 cost cards and you play a Channel Lake Frigid and pass, then their turn, you can kind of see what the value of their turn is by pitching this blue to play their 3 0 cost attacks and calculate that. So let's say your Fi opponent goes Rising Resentment into Blaze Headlong into Snatch or something. Then you add that up. You're like, that was worth 11 points of damage. And then you look at what their hand would have been if you didn't put a channel in play. And they go Rising Resentment into Blazing Headlong into Searing Emberblade into Phoenix Flame into Snatch. And that's 4 extra damage. So if you could have blocked more than 4 points of damage with this channel and the other card you used to pay for the channel, it would have been better to just block instead of play it out. Assuming you keep the channel around for 1 turn and you don't keep it around a second turn, because hitting 2 ice cards is a big ask for most decks that play it, getting 2 ice cards to your pitch zone. So ideally, you want to, again, have a supercomputer and tell you the average value of your opponent's hand if you don't play Channel Lake Frigid, and tell you the average value of their hand if you do play it. And what it would actually do is take every possible hand that they could have and how likely they are, and it would compare the value of that hand with a channel in play versus that value of that hand without a channel in play. And that would tell you whether you should play the channel or the Channel Lake Frigid or not. And most hands in the game by most heroes, if you're only keeping a channel in play for 1 turn, you're usually not getting enough points of value out of it to make it worth playing. And a big part of that is because if they take 3 actions that turn, they need to pay 3 extra resources, which is 1 full card, whereas channel costs almost 2 full cards to play it. So like you're usually paying more for the channel than they're paying to pay for the channel taxes.
Okay. The math checks out.
And then the last thing that I want to try to assign value to is putting permanents into play. Think of Energy Potion, Amulet of Ice, Amulet of Earth, Frost Hex, those kind of things that just stay there or situationally, or stay there until you use them or stay there forever, depending on what they are. So a card like Frost Hex is, at the end of the game, it's very simple to see how much the Frost Hex was worth. You look at how much damage the Frostbites did, and that's how much damage the Frost Hex was worth. So if you have 1 Frost Hex in play and 3 of their turns, they took 1 damage from a Frostbite, this Frost Hex was worth 3 points of damage because they took 3 damage from it, basically. And you won't know until the end of the game, but most of the time it's going to be pretty difficult to get the 6 or 7 points of value out of a Frost Hex that you really need for it to be worth it. And the reason it needs to be worth 6 or 7 points is because you have to pitch a blue and play the Frost Hex, which takes 2 full cards, and 2 full cards usually block for about 6. Or if they're worth 3 points each, they should be worth about 6 points. And the average card's worth a little bit more than 3 in Class Constructed, but 3's a fine base point. And if you're just blocking with that and a 3 block blue, then that would be 6. So other permanents, Amulet of Ice is a card I'm going to the Icelander cards first because they're the easy ones. So Amulet of Ice is also generally just trades for a card. So you play your amulet, and then at some point you do an ice fuse. They do whatever, you let your thing resolve. And then if they have 0 or 1 resources left over at the end, you can sacrifice your Amulet of Ice, and they'll have to either pitch a full another card or discard a full card. And it can get kind of awkward in multiples because if they have one resource floating and you sack the amulet and they pitch another blue, then they'll have two resources floating, and then your next amulet doesn't work. So if you have too many amulets in play and not enough ice fuse, it can be hard to get the full value out of it. And that's why you kind of need to evaluate those things, like evaluate the value of the amulet of ice. But a lot of the time, it's just going to be worth a full card, which you're happy to trade a card for a card most of the time. Or there's not really like it's, I guess happy's the wrong way to put that. You're breaking even most of the time, which is fine. And you kind of have some control over the timing of when you make that exchange, such as you can time it on a turn that Briar just kept the Channel Mount Heroic play. And that's great because that makes it harder for her to get full value out of the Channel Mount Heroic. So another permanent is Energy Potion. When you play Energy Potion, it takes a card and an action point to play it. And then at some point, you're going to turn this Energy Potion into 2 resources. And trading a card and an action point for 2 resources is a pretty bad deal. Just straight up, it's a bad deal. But the reason Energy Potion is powerful is because you can gain those 2 resources whenever you want. It's not you're spending a card and action point for 2 extra resources the next turn. It's not, unless you want it the next turn, but you control when you get those resources. So maybe you want them on the turn that your hand, maybe having those 2 resources would turn your hand into dealing like 6 extra points of damage or something. And that can happen sometimes. It's not the average hand, but maybe you have multiple red 1-cost cards, and having an Energy Potion can give you the ability to play both of them instead of having to pitch one to play the other.
Yeah. Okay. I'm following.
So when you're playing, then you want to look at how much value you're getting out of Energy Potion. And again, we need a supercomputer that could tell you exactly how much value you get from it on average from turning whatever the hand that most optimally uses the Energy Potion into whatever it becomes when it uses that hand versus what it would be if you didn't have the Energy Potion, the value of the hand. And that's kind of how you get the value of it. And that's really hard to do, but you kind of want to pick up on it from just playing with the card and paying a lot of attention to how much value it's actually worth in the games that you activate it and play it. And you can use that as your basis going forward to try to evaluate it.
Sure. So let's go back to our Razor Reflex hand. Let's say we use our Razor Reflex action point to play an Energy Potion. Did we get 4 points of value off of our Razor Reflex then? And then was Energy Potion worth it because we wouldn't have had any other way to spend our action point otherwise?
So again, it really depends on how much value you get out of the Energy Potion later. And
so you're going to get 2 resources out of it.
Right. But those 2 resources are just worth whatever. So the Energy Potion, the value of the Energy Potion is whatever the value of the hand that you use Energy Potion on would be if you used it most optimally without the Energy Potion versus what it becomes because you use the Energy Potion on it. So if you look at a 5 hand, and let's say we have 2 Mounting Angers, a Ronin Renegade, and a Lava Burst. So if you have Energy Potion, you can go pop Energy Potion, Mounting Anger for 4, Mounting Anger for 4, Rising Resentment for 3, or Ronin Renegade, whatever I said, into Lava Burst. And that's 4 for each. Mounting Anger is 8 plus 3 for the attack with Gogan, and then 5 for the Lava Burst would be 16 points of value. And let's say you don't have an Energy Potion on that hand. The most efficient way you can use that hand now becomes pitch something to play a Mounting Anger.
I can't believe you forgot to activate 5 to get your Phoenix Flame for free, but well.
No, I missed the point. 17 points. 18 if you have Shuko.
And your Tiger Stripe Shuko, yeah.
So let's say that's the most efficient way to use that hand is 18 points with the Energy Potion. And if you don't have the Energy Potion, now you look at the hand of Ronin, Lava Burst, and the 2 1-for-4s. And what is the most efficient thing you can do with that hand? It's probably pitch a Mounting Anger, play a Mounting Anger, play a Ronin Renegade, play a Lava Burst, and you get 9 points there.
I would arsenal the Lava Burst, but that's just me.
Sure. If your arsenal has like a Heart of Final or something in it, so we're just ignoring arsenal. And
that's a whole another side. Like we haven't touched arsenals for a reason, buddy.
Yeah, that just adds so much complexity to this, and this is why Flesh and Blood is such a good game, and it's all simple math, but simple math with another step, and then another step, and then another thing, and another what if this, but another what if this, and like it makes it really obfuscated about what the actual value of everything is. But like your goal is trying to figure out what the actual value of everything is, I guess. So if you jump back to that Phi hand and we say it's worth 9 damage without the energy potion, 18 damage with the energy potion, then the energy potion is responsible for 9 damage, right? Because you turned a 9 damage hand into an 18 damage hand. And if we jump back to that Phi hand one more time, and instead of doing whatever the line was we did, maybe you get the opportunity to block with your hand, and you can block with the 2 mounting angers and the lava burst, and then just play the 0 for 3. Then you'd block for 7 and attack for 3, and that'd be 10 points of value. So again, you can get more value out of the hand, but like, and if that was something you could do, then the energy potion would have been worth 8, and because you're going from 10 to 18. And that's how you can evaluate it during the game and after the game, or after the game and once you've played it in the game. But like, when you're deciding to play an energy potion, you need to you kind of have to think about the average of, if you were to play 1,000 games from this game point, how much value are you going to get from it on average? But you can figure that out by calculating it after other games and kind of working from there to try to figure out what the average is going to be. All right. Well, we're talking about value. Next point.
That's what this whole episode's about, baby.
You want to maximize the value you get out of your equipment as well. And equipment's very different from hands, because equipment is just a permanent that sits in play and you can use it whenever you want to, basically, for the most part. And
dash exceptions apply.
Yeah. And the first thing is most equipment, or a lot of equipment blocks, and you want to try to get the most out of these blocks. And the most obvious response is, well, if it blocks for 2, no matter what, it doesn't really matter when I use it, right? It's going to get 2 points of value. But you can reduce the value of your opponent's hand by stopping on hits. So if they play a snatch and you block with 2 block equipment, then they blocked your 2 block equipment blocked 4 points of damage, and whatever the value of that snatch on hit was, they prevented. So you want to try to use it when it's stopping on hits or stopping damage that's worth more than just damage. When it's damage that if it hits, it'll get something else, some other form of value.
Yeah, like winning the game. Winning the game damage is pretty good on hits.
That is fair. But lethal damage is still just like, it doesn't actually have an on hit. Like, you die if it hits, but like if you blocked something else earlier with the armor, you just have two more life. So it wouldn't be lethal at that point, if that makes sense. So like, if you are using your armor to block vanilla damage that is lethal, then vanilla damage is damage without an on hit. Vanilla damage that is lethal, then you aren't getting extra value out of it, because you're like, well, the on hit is I lose the game. You're just preventing vanilla damage. And if there was a spot earlier in the game where you could have used it to maybe get more than just preventing vanilla damage, then that would have been a better way to use it. Again, this is like something that you figure out after the game, and you go back and you try to like think, if you used it in this spot, it would have been better. But is the average that they're not actually going to play another on hit?
Obviously, blade break equipment, so you have to value the life you're getting, or the value of it, versus the future value that you could potentially get. So like a card like Tiger Stripe Shuko. So you could just block 2 damage plus a snatch and a 2 block in your hand early in the game to stop a snatch. But like, are you giving up like the ability to push extra damage in the future because you're doing that? So you obviously have to assign a value to the ability of the card while it sits in play as well, right?
Yeah. And the value of Shuko over the course of a game is every time you trigger it, it's worth 1 point. And then when you block with it, you're getting 2 block out of it. So essentially, like if you block with it on turn 1, you're getting the 2 value out of it, and you're losing out on all the value from all the triggers. So you have to decide if blocking with it now is worth stopping the snatch on hit. And if there's maybe you also need to compare that to the value of just like, if you block with a 2 block from your hand, what would your hand be worth if you block with a 2 block and from hand and a different piece of armor and keep the Shuko? And these are all just like comparisons you just have to make during the game. And you can kind of, again, play lots of games with Tiger Stripe Shuko, and you can figure out how much damage it gets you on average. And then the 2 value from block, maybe you trigger it about 3 times in most aggro mirrors, and then you block. That's 5 points value that it's worth. But again, you're not giving up the full 5 points if you block with it early. You're still getting your 2 points of block. And then if you're stopping a snatch on hit and you're valuing that at around 3, then you're still getting your full value out of it, I guess.
What about the unpreventable damage nature of the value? What's that worth?
It's not worth anything unless it causes damage to go through that wouldn't go through. Yeah. So against Prism with spectral shields, or Yenderai, or Oasis Respite, if they wanted to Oasis Respite your little attack.
Or Oldheim's Earth Reaction. Or Crown of Seeds.
Yeah, though it's kind of weird against Earth React and Crown of Seeds, because The way it works is it doesn't eat up the prevention, it just stops the prevention from happening. So if you have a Chronoseeds floating and Shuko triggers, I'm fairly certain this is how it works. Damage can't be prevented, so the Oldheim trigger will just prevent the next damage that would come, the Chronoseeds trigger.
I'm not the world champion, so I'll take your word for it, but I need to call up Josh Scott after this episode's done just to make sure.
I'm fairly certain that's how it works, and we can confirm afterwards, but yeah. So the other thing with equipment is some equipment have activated abilities or abilities other than blocking that you sacrifice them to use. And you kind of have to just, again, evaluate the delta in value of the hand that you use them on. So if your hand without the equipment would be worth 10 points, but if you sack your Aether Iron Weave, it's worth 16 points, then the Iron Weave activation there is worth 6 points. And you want to find the point in the game where that value is the highest it'll be during the game, and that's when you should sacrifice your
armor. Do you
armor.
subtract the value for any floating resources, though, then? So let's say you crack over 2 resources, and you only use one of those resources to push your 16 damage. Just go to 15?
No. Because the total value of the hand is just however much life you gain and damage you deal. So
okay, so value is always assigned in damage.
Yes. So you get, if you deal 16 damage and you would have dealt 10 damage, or your hand would have been worth 10 value, because maybe if you don't use your Aether Iron Weave, the optimal play is like block with 2 cards and then play something or something. And that's how you get to 10. But with Iron Weave, you can get to 16. And I don't know the exact line of cards that you're playing to make this happen, but then it doesn't matter if you just spend one of the 2 resources to swing Rosetta Thorn. It doesn't matter that you waste the other resource. It's just like what the difference in value is between using it there and not using it.
But what happens if you could have used that other resource later down the line for more value?
So again, you get, let's say if the Iron Weave activation is turning this hand from 10 to 16, then later down the line, when you're looking at a brand new hand and you look at your hand and you're like, man, if I had Aether Iron Weave, I could use both these 2 resources and it's going to turn my hand from 11 into 16. It's still 5 points of damage, and 5 is less than 6. So that's just how you should compare it.
Okay.
It doesn't matter whether you use both resources or not.
I'm just also keeping in like the history of like our yellow conversation. So it's just like, it's interesting that pitching a yellow and not getting the extra resource is really bad compared to pitching a blue, but this resource that we're floating and throwing away doesn't matter. So these are more talking about how you should play in game, and the yellow conversation is more about a deck building issue where like if your deck is pitching yellows every turn, your deck is just not built as efficiently as possible. Well, I mean, if your deck's not built to maximize the 2 resources off of Aether Iron Weave, then it should be, built better to make sure you can always use both the resources off of Aether Iron Weave. It's just a deck building issue.
You don't need to always be able to use the 2 resources from Aether Iron Weave.
Oh, okay.
Because usually the most efficient use of your Aether Iron Weave the one that gives you the most points of value will be because it's using both resources. But generally, that'll be worth 1 more point of value than popping the Iron Weave and only using 1 resource. But that's not always the case. So in game, you just want to look at what the value you actually get out of it is. And it doesn't matter.
Okay, I agree. I'm with you so far.
Okay. And the way you determine value is how much your hand would be worth if you didn't use the Aether Iron Weave, and how much it's worth if you do use the Aether Iron Weave. And that value is just the total change in life totals. So you dealing, or I guess damage presented also. So you present 16 damage by sacrificing Aether Iron Weave, or you present 10 damage without sacrificing it, then it was worth 6. Regardless of whether you use 1 or both of those resources, the Iron Weave was worth 6 points of value.
Sure, yeah, I'm all on board. I think this episode is best highlighting as to why I'm taking the LSAT and going into law, and why you can nail an actuary exam. And it's just the difference between, how our respective mind works. But your mind clearly is better for a game like Flesh and Blood because you're the world champion, and I'm, I guess not. So I don't know if you've noticed that.
You didn't even go.
Yeah, it was fine. I didn't need to go.
Okay. So we've been going for a while. I got 2 more points. I kind of want to move through a little quicker if that's...
Let's go for it. Let's go for it, baby.
All right. So the next thing you can work on is learn your opponent's deck and build a game plan to beat it. So when you're playing Flesh and Blood against different decks, you're not going to know what everyone does at first. And as you play against them more, You'll learn what things they're doing that are powerful. And basically, there's almost always room to improve your game plan in a different deck. Maybe there's specific cards that line up really well into them, or maybe you are diluting your main game plan by trying to interact with their game plan when you could just do your thing and they will die because your thing's stronger than their thing. And you don't actually need to try to find ways to interact with their thing and dilute your game plan. And the main way to learn these things is getting games in with the other decks, your opponent's decks. And if you play their deck, you'll kind of learn it better, I guess, and learn kind of what it's vulnerable to. And I think just general understanding of different decks in the format is something that is always good to work on. And another thing is if you don't have time, or maybe you don't always play all the other decks, it's also could be very helpful to kind of just watch replays of other decks or videos of them, or even like there's a lot of content on a lot of different decks out there. And if you watch that content, it'll help you at least know what the other decks are trying to do and help you build a reasonable plan against it.
Yeah, like the content on www.patreon.com/Manor Podcast, where you can watch Manor University and watch all kind of diverse matchups by the best players in the world. As Michael and I break down play by play is exactly what's going on. One of the best resources for learning, I think. But go on, Michael.
All right, I'm going to go to the next point, and this is my last one. So this one, try to minimize your quote unquote bad hands through deck building and sideboarding. So in a lot of my examples, I'd point to the value of a hand and be like, yeah, this is worth 9 or this is worth 10. And if you ever look at a 4-card hand and you're like, this is worth 9 or 10 points of value, something's probably going wrong. And that's usually something that you can address through sideboarding differently or building your deck differently. Most of the time, if you draw a hand that's worth 9 points of value, then it's because...
Then you're playing Icelander?
No, your Icelander hands aren't worth 9 points of value most of the time. They're usually more than that.
Are they?
Yeah. What do you mean? You got a bunch of 3 blocks. You got a bunch of Waning Moons stuff.
If your hand's 2 blue frostings and a Wounded Bull, it's 9 points of value. If you're behind,
2 blue frostings, a random other blue and Wounding Bull.
No, 2 blue frostings and the Wounded Bull.
That's a 3-card hand.
And Amulet Device.
Okay, so that's worth way more than 9. Because first off, you can just block with 2 frostings and play the Wounding Bull, and that's 6 points for the frostings and 8 points for the Wounding Bull. That's 14.
Oh yeah, okay.
Second, if you have a 4-card hand because your opponent didn't attack or something, you can still play the Amulet Device, which is worth a card later, which we can value at around 3. It's actually worth probably more than that because it's worth whatever the average value of a card in a constructed deck is, or the worst card in the worst card in their hand would, how much the worst card of their hand would increase the value of their hand when you activate Amulet Device, which again, supercomputer, but probably a little more than 3. And you can also pitch the Frosting to activate Waning Moon now that you've played it, non-attack action for 2 more points, and then you can Wounding Bull for 8, and that's 10 points plus the Amulet Device value, which is probably around 3, so 13. Much more than 9 or 10.
Okay.
And again, so whenever you do have bad hands that are not worth a lot of value, you really want to look at your deck and your sideboard decisions and try to think about what other, if you replace one of the cards, maybe a card that you're experimenting with or a card that just is in your hand, look at basically look at every card in that hand and try to think about if you replace them with other cards, if any of them would significantly alter the value of the hand, significantly increase it basically. And if it would, you want to pay a lot of attention to that and try to find other spots where maybe this other card would be worth a lot too. And maybe if there's enough spots where just switching maybe a mediocre blue for this other blue would increase the value of the hands enough times, then that's when you want to start making those changes and start changing your deck.
Okay.
All right. And then if a card is also frequently responsible for hands that are not worth, or hands that are weak, or hands that are not worth enough value, then that's probably where you want to look for a card to cut too.
Makes sense to me.
Or even a card that's just bad in the matchup that you're playing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. And that's all my points. That's all the things I have to work on. So I'm going to read through them again, and then we'll go into whatever more questions you want to ask. So maximize value hand to hand. Try to assign value to things, even things that don't have clear value. Maximize value of your equipment. Learn your opponent's deck and build a game plan to beat it. And minimize bad hands through deck building and sideboarding. Those are the 5 things to work on.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait to become a better 5 player through these 5 key steps.
Great. Do you feel like this was helpful?
Mm-hmm. I'm a much better 5 player than I was I wanted to say 57 minutes, but it won't be 57 minutes by the time I'm done editing. But then I was 45 minutes ago.
Okay, awesome. I'm glad to hear it.
I feel like what we should do is we should tie a little bow on this episode, and we could present it as Michael's good tips for getting good at Fab Good, and then
Good at Fab Good.
and we should just have an episode called Roger Asks Michael Questions. Because I feel like I could just ask you like 3 hours worth of questions based on everything you just went over here. Because like there's a lot. And like I feel like this also like informs our other episode that you like the least, which is the tempo episode, where I'm also thinking of things much more contextually, and you're always thinking of things much more numerically. And so a lot of my questions would center around the concept of like tempo, and like, okay, here's like one question that my mind wandered off to maybe like 30 minutes ago, and it's just been sitting in the back of my mind ever since. So like, does the proportion of damage to the hero's life total matter? So like a point of damage to Kano is worth a 30th of his life, where a point of damage to Oldheim is worth a 40th of his life. So do you get more value out of damaging Kano than you do Oldheim?
So I would say no, but in general, in order for Kano to win against Oldheim or any hero that has 40 life, you need to find 10 additional points of value throughout the course of the game to make up for that life total gap in Class Constructed.
And you do that by playing Energy Potion.
What?
Because Kano always wants to play 3 Energy Potions.
So because Kano's damage is multiplicative with Aether Wildfire into Blazing Aether, because it's multiplicative, a lot of the time Kano's losing the value exchange until he has that big turn, and that turn is usually worth way, way more than any turn that any other hero would potentially do to him, basically. And that's kind of what he relies on to make up for the 10 life total gap. But you could still just calculate how much damage the Wildfire turn is worth, whether he is, and it doesn't really matter that he starts at 10 less life. It just means that he has to, if he started at 40 life, it'd be the same. He just have to win, or he just have 10 more points of value to give up over the course of the game. And because he's at 30, he still needs to win. He just needs to win by 10 more points of value, basically. He needs to find 10 more points of value than his opponent does.
And then, so like, what about like decks that just die when they hit 11 life into Icelander, though? Like, that's her finding that extra value, but doesn't that mean like the damage that she's presenting scales differently than the damage that other heroes are presenting then as well? I guess like, if we don't even think about it like ratios, but I'm thinking about like damage scale, like, is there like any damage scaling that you have to evaluate in this game?
So I guess what basically, I'm going to go to an extreme here. If you had a hero that started with 1 life total point, then suddenly everything is a must block. You have to block everything. You can't take a point of damage. So even if your hand is more efficient to take all the damage, if you just die, then you obviously can't take all the damage. So like that life total difference makes it so the most efficient way to use your hand is off the table, because you only have 1 life total point. And I wouldn't say that like damage is like, you still, like if you start at 1 life, they start at 40. You need to get 39 points of value over them throughout the course of the game. And you also have this condition where any damage you take kills you. So you have suddenly every 1 point of damage attack is a must block. And because every 1 point of damage is a must block, then it becomes harder to use your hand efficiently, right? Because if you block a Kodachi with a full card, then you're trading that card for 1 point of value because you're preventing 1 damage with it.
Okay.
So I think that's my long-winded way of saying that having a lower life total when you get to lethal ranges changes how you have to play, but I don't think it actually changes the value of things, because you're still just trying to win out in value over the course of a game. And if you are a hero that just loses if you get to 10 health against Icelander, then you just have to win the game by 10 points of value before you get to that point. Or like you have to get 10 more points of value out of your cards above Icelander before you get to that point, basically.
Okay. I think I'll disagree, but we'll pick this up in a different episode.
Okay.
Any final thoughts that you have, though, Michael?
This episode was harder than I expected it to be.
Yeah. Whenever you come into a an episode just trying to explain things to me, I'm always
Mhm.
gonna be the devil's advocate or the contrarian or just, I guess, the dumbest person on the face of the planet, because I want to make sure that every single person who wants to come in here and like actually learn and take things away isn't wasting their time, I guess. And I think one of the hardest elements to teaching is just realizing how much you take for granted, or like not understanding the gaps on like what your true understanding in a matter is versus what they're not understanding. And I just want to like address those gaps of like understanding more so most of the time. So that's usually the train of thought I'm using when I'm questioning you, unless I'm trying to troll you, and who knows what that ratio is.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to tell when it's a troll versus when it's a helpful question.
Yeah, as you're well aware at this point, it's a great way to also disguise my actual stupidity, because sometimes I'll say something just dumb as fuck. And it's like, oh, I'm not actually dumb. I was trolling. Ha 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 ha.
That is a classic Roger move.
It's a helpful life strategy.
All right. Well,
Well, I
thanks
guess on that
everybody.
note,
Thanks
all
everybody
right.
for listening. And remember to like and subscribe.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next time you're trying to learn how to maximize your value of Flesh and Blood, always remember, mind your manners. Thanks for listening.